Brazil's Supreme Court. Wow. Accused of being both a beacon of hope, can you imagine? And a threat to freedom? How did one court become the center of such a heated controversy? That's what we're going to try to unpack today as we take a deep dive into the heart of Brazilian democracy. And our guide for this, a really revealing New York Times interview with Chief Justice Luís Roberto Barroso.
It's really quite fascinating when you think about it. I mean, this isn't some abstract legal debate, you know. We're talking about the very soul of a nation grappling with its past, its present, and its future.
You're right. The stakes are incredibly high. And Barroso himself, he acknowledges that. He knows the court's actions, especially those concerning former President Jair Bolsonaro and his supporters, have been, well, let's just say, anything but ordinary.
And what's really striking, I think, is his argument, his assertion that the court's strong, forceful response, it was a direct, and he says, necessary reaction. A reaction to what? To this global wave of far-right movements that he believes are actively trying to, get this, undermine democratic institutions.
He doesn't mince words either. He paints a very, very stark picture of what he calls, and these are his words, an existential threat. An existential threat to Brazilian democracy. And as evidence, he points to that, well, that chilling image we all saw, the tank parade, remember that, rolling right through the Capitol, a blatant show of force. And then you have the direct threats from Bolsonaro himself, even talking about flying planes over the Supreme Court building. And of course, who could forget the attempted coup after the election?
Yeah, and this is where understanding the historical context is absolutely crucial, because Brazil, unlike a lot of Western democracies, they have this relatively recent history of military coups. So the trauma of those periods, it lingers, it resonates deeply. Any perceived threat, any little thing that looks like it might be a threat to democratic order, it becomes really, really charged, emotionally charged.
Barroso, he gets that. He emphasizes this context again and again. He argues that, look, these weren't normal times, right? So they couldn't be met with, a business as usual kind of judicial response. He seems to be saying, look, extraordinary times, they demand extraordinary measures.
And that's exactly the heart of this whole debate. Because, yes, the emotional weight of these events, nobody's denying that. But legal experts will tell you, when you start invoking context to justify these sweeping actions, well, you're setting a dangerous precedent. So the question becomes, at what point does a response, even to a real threat, when does it start to actually erode the very democratic principles that it's supposed to be protecting?
And this is where I think it gets really, really complicated. So, see, critics of the court, they're not just voicing concerns, They're saying, look, the court itself, it crossed a line, a dangerous line. And they did it in the name of protecting democracy, ironically.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about some pretty serious stuff. Jailing people. And this is the thing, without even formally charging them. Authorizing raids. And think about this, based on online criticism, and this is where it gets really dicey, silencing dissenting voices on social media. It's like, how do you square those actions with a free and open society? It's tough.
It really is. And it's gotten attention, not just within Brazil, but internationally, too. A lot of people are asking, when does defending democracy, when does it start to actually eat away at the freedoms that, that underpin it? It's a question a lot of countries are dealing with, right? I mean, look at what's happening with misinformation, online hate speech, the threat of violence even, motivated by political ideologies. It's a tough one.
For sure. And there's no easy answer, no clear-cut solution.
What's interesting is Barroso, he gets it, he hears those criticisms, and he confronts them head on. He says, yeah, we took extraordinary measures, but they were justified. He says they were absolutely necessary, given what was going on, to protect the future of Brazilian democracy.
And that right there, that's what legal scholars and political scientists will be debating probably for decades. Because, yes, Brazil's constitution, it's like a lot of constitutions. It allows for emergency powers, right, in times of crisis. But did this situation, did it truly warrant such extreme measures? I mean, that's a big question, and maybe an even bigger one is what happens now. What are the lasting consequences of these actions? How does it affect democratic norms going forward? What about the public's trust in its institutions?
It's a balancing act, isn't it? Trying to find that balance, and there's no easy answer.
Nope, not at all.
One thing I thought was really interesting, this idea of, different democracies, they approach freedom of speech in different ways. Barroso even says that the U.S. concept of the First Amendment, it's actually kind of an outlier. Like other democracies, they might choose to handle hate speech and online harms very differently.
Yeah, that's a key point. The U.S. model for free speech, it's incredibly permissive. Like the bar for government intervention is really, really high. Even in cases of hate speech, it's tough to do anything about it. But a lot of other democracies, they put a higher priority on safeguarding individuals from hate speech or stopping the spread of misinformation, even if it means limiting certain types of speech. So you have this whole spectrum of approaches to balancing those rights.
So it's almost like you're seeing two different interpretations of democratic principles at play here, which just adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing. I mean, it's not as simple as saying one side is right and one side is wrong, is it?
Exactly. And I think this whole situation just highlights how incredibly difficult it is to take these universal principles and apply them in different cultural and historical contexts. What one nation sees as a justifiable limit on speech for the greater good, right? Another nation might see that as censorship, plain and simple. It's a really, really delicate dance.
This whole idea of controlling the narrative online, well, it brings us to another really interesting case study. The court's clash with Elon Musk, the whole blocking of X, what used to be Twitter, in Brazil. Now, on the surface, it might seem like a totally separate issue, but it really gets at the court's power in this digital age, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was huge news, right? Everyone was talking about it. And it raised some really big questions. Was this, as some people argued, was it the court just overreaching? Or was it a legitimate attempt, to actually enforce national laws in a space that's kind of inherently borderless, the digital world? I mean, it's a question with some pretty huge implications.
It really is. And Barroso's take on it is, well, it's interesting. He says, look, this wasn't about censorship, not at all. It was about upholding Brazilian law, plain and simple. See, there's this law in Brazil that says foreign companies, if you're going to operate here, you got to have people, representatives physically present in the country. And X, well, they weren't exactly following that rule.
And this is what's so fascinating about this case. It really throws a spotlight on this tension that exists between, on one hand, you have national sovereignty, the right of a country to make its own laws and enforce them, right? And on the other hand, you have this global internet. They're constantly bumping into each other. So the question is, can a country, any country, can it actually enforce its laws on these companies that are operating across borders, often without, like I said, any real physical presence? And then the bigger question, if they can, what does that mean for information online? Are we going to start seeing the internet carved up, divided? It's a big deal.
It really is. It's like, whose rules apply where?
Yeah.
Big, big question. And Barroso seems to be saying, look, Brazil, we have every right to hold these tech giants accountable. They're no different, right? Just because they're tech giants doesn't make them above the law.
And you can't overstate the precedent this sets. Because if Brazil can do it, if they can force X to comply, what's to stop other countries from doing the exact same thing?
Exactly. And then are we headed towards this future where the internet, which everybody thought was going to be this, this borderless utopia, is going to become more and more fragmented, subject to the whims of every country and their own laws, their own regulations? It's a big question mark.
No easy answers, that's for sure. And it all kind of leads to what might be the most important question here. If Brazil's Supreme Court has this much power, right, they're shaping the digital world, they're redrawing the lines of freedom, all in the name of protecting democracy, well, who's keeping an eye on them? Who watches the watchers, right? That's the age-old question, isn't it? Whenever you give an entity a lot of power, you have to ask, how do we make sure they're accountable? Especially when you're talking about something as fundamental as a country's constitution, right? Interpreting it, upholding it. How do you make sure that the very institution that's supposed to be protecting democracy, how do you make sure it doesn't become a threat to democracy? Tricky stuff.
It is. And Barroso, to his credit, he responds to that concern. He says, ultimately, the court, it answers to the people, to society. He says their legitimacy, it depends on the public understanding their decisions, even the controversial ones.
Which sounds good, right? But does it really hold up?
Yeah.
I mean, just because the public understands something, does that automatically equal accountability? Are there mechanisms in place, real mechanisms, to make sure there's transparency, to make sure the public can actually engage in a meaningful way in these complex legal issues? And here's the big one. What happens when a big chunk of that public, what happens when they just flat out disagree with the court's actions, which is what's happening in Brazil? Then what?
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure. But hopefully, as we come to the end of our deep dive here, you have a better understanding of what's happening in Brazil. It's complex, it's messy, you've got these contradictory forces all pulling at democracy from different directions. The Supreme Court, some people see them as heroes, right? Standing up to authoritarianism, protecting the country. Others see them as, well, a danger, overstepping their bounds, putting the very freedoms they claim to protect at risk.
Yeah, and the thing is, this isn't just some theoretical debate we're having in a classroom. This is real life. This is happening right now, and it has very real consequences for the people of Brazil. And like we've been talking about, these questions, the power of the courts, what does freedom of speech really mean, how do we make democracies work, these are relevant everywhere. It's not just a Brazil thing. Look around, the world is grappling with these same questions.
And the story's still being written, folks. There's no neat ending here, no easy answers. But I think if we can all just take the time to try to understand what's going on, to really listen to each other, even when we disagree, and most importantly, to hold those in power accountable, maybe, just maybe, we can navigate these choppy waters and come out on the other side with a stronger, more resilient vision of what democracy can be. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.